are Jesus and the Easter Bunny best pals? And that's a logical question, really, if you consider how differently many of us view this holiday. My son has a friend who says that Easter is her very favorite holiday, and it's not because she goes to church. It's because of the Easter Bunny and the chocolate, and because it's connected to spring. And on the other end of the spectrum, many of my evangelical friends celebrate Easter as the event by which the salvation of the world is won. But most of us, I think, are somewhere in between, with varying degrees of observance and reverence for this holy day. Some people use the resurrection as a kind of test of orthodoxy, and they ask this question: do you believe in the resurrection? And your answer to them will dictate whether you are in or out of their particular community. But that question, do you believe in the resurrection, is a problematic one, because it's immediately met with the next question, which is, what do you mean by the resurrection? For some, if you don't believe that Jesus underwent some kind of resuscitation, where he was dead and then he began to breathe again and got up out of the tomb and started to walk around, then you don't really believe in the resurrection. And for other people, Jesus was resurrected for sure, but with a new and glorified body, something that was physical, but not one like ours. And that seems to explain how he could just appear out of nowhere, and why he was seen but not recognized until, for instance, he spoke Mary Magdalene's name, or until he broke bread when he met the ones on the road to Emmaus. And still others think that the resurrection was really just a series of visions that the disciples had. They were visions such as those that are not uncommon when someone who you love has died. People often say, I saw them, I'm sure I saw them. And then there are others who say that the resurrection occurred in the community amongst the disciples, and that it had nothing to do with a body appearing on earth and walking and talking to his followers. So that question, do you believe in the resurrection, is a loaded one. And I think it's particularly troublesome when it becomes a test of your faith, because the truth is, we can't know what actually occurred in the raising of Jesus of Nazareth, the one that they called the Anointed One. All we know and can be sure of is that something happened that energized this community that had been disheartened and defeated, and transformed them into a group of true believers who proclaimed a risen Christ to all who would hear. It is proclaimed in the words of Peter at this day of Pentecost, which happens later, when he says to his Jewish brothers and sisters, after he explains to them that this Jesus of Nazareth is the one that you crucified. And then he says, this Jesus God raised up, and of that all of us are witnesses. Jesus was raised up, and of that all of us are witnesses. Their account, their experience of the risen Christ was such that they proclaimed a risen Christ. And this is the essence of Easter, because though Jesus was crucified and buried and left for dead, somehow in the mystery of God, Jesus is alive and among us. And we are the witnesses. And this is the key. It's not what we believe about the resurrection. It's what we bear witness to. And in bearing witness, the emphasis is on how we've experienced the risen Christ, and not in the careful articulation of what actually happened. And so that problem with the question, do you believe in the resurrection, is that too often it puts the emphasis on whether something actually happened instead of how it was experienced and continues to be experienced. In the Christian scriptures, they often talk about what's called in the Greek pistis. Now, that's been translated into English as faith or belief. And because we're in this scientific era, we think of belief as a commitment to a certain set of facts. People who are concerned about what you believe are big on creeds and statements of faith that can clearly articulate their faith and make sure that everything is in its place. And when they say the Apostles' Creed, for instance, like we did, it has to be as if all these things are literally true. But pistis in Greek should more accurately be translated as trust rather than belief. And trust has a very different feel to it because it doesn't require exactness. Trust is based on relationships and not on indisputable facts. And it allows for mystery and imperfect understanding. And it doesn't require rigid adherence to a statement of faith. And so if someone asks me, do you believe in the resurrection? My response might well be, I don't know. But I trust in the resurrection. And why? Because although God is eternal and beautiful mystery quite apart from my life, God breaks through in the stories which surround Jesus. And so we say in our communion liturgy that this is the mystery of our faith. Christ has died. Christ is risen. Christ will come again. Easter, like life itself, is fraught with all the textures that we find in human life. Crucifixion is a crucial part of resurrection. The agony, as they say, is contained in the ecstasy. And the mystery of our faith is this movement that we see from darkness into light, from death to life, from despair to hope. And what we begin to understand as we follow in the way of Jesus is that on the other side of the cross, there is always resurrection. Take the disciples, for instance. When Jesus was arrested, they scattered and they went into hiding, and they were absent even at the crucifixion of this one that they had called their master. And yet, when Jesus is raised, he comes to them with love and compassion. Because in the mystery of the Easter moment, they realize that on the other side of fear, there is always joy. And then we have Peter, this wonderfully flawed character. To his credit, he didn't disappear when Jesus was arrested. He kind of hung around to see what would happen. But in the process, he ended up denying not once but 3 times that he even knew Jesus. And yet, Peter is the first of the disciples to see that Jesus has been raised. In the earliest accounts, Jesus appears first to Peter, is what Paul says. And so in the Easter moment, Peter learned that on the other side of betrayal is always forgiveness. And then there was this one disciple who stood at the cross while Jesus suffered, and he was called the beloved disciple, or the one whom Jesus loved. And for him, crucifixion brought loss and grief. And as he rushed to the tomb with Peter, he too saw that the body was missing. And he believed, it says. He saw that the grave clothes were empty. And for him, this resurrection confirmed that on the other side of despair, there is always hope. And for Mary Magdalene, whom Jesus had healed, it says, of 7 demons, and demons in that time meant illness. She who stood with the beloved disciple at the cross, for her, the resurrection was a complete transformation of everything. She came to the tomb to prepare his body. She came to mourn his passing. And she finds an empty tomb and assumes that, like many other tombs at that time, that this one had been robbed. "They have taken my Lord," she says. And though she runs to the disciples to tell them, and though she speaks with two angels, and though she weeps and is frantic at the loss, it isn't until the one she assumes is the gardener says her name, Mary. And then she recognizes that the tomb is empty because Jesus has risen. She is the first to see the risen Christ. And in that moment, her grief is transformed. And in the years that followed, she was recognized as an apostle, a leader in the Christian community, even though she was a woman. Because for Mary, on the other side of grief is always courage. Resurrection is the stuff of life that has to be experienced to be understood. And so when we open ourselves to renewal in God, we move from fear to joy, from betrayal to forgiveness, from despair to hope, from grief to courage, from crucifixion to resurrection. This is the mystery of our faith. And so we come to the table, wounded, grieving, sick, discouraged, broken. And we partake of this great mystery, this resurrection moment. And as we eat of the bread of life and we drink the cup of hope, we are transformed by resurrection love. We trust in this resurrection of Jesus, the center of our faith and of our lives, because we have seen it and we have experienced it, and we are the witnesses. Amen. We're going